Shalom and welcome to Teshuvah Bible Studies. My name is Van, and today I'm going to be conducting an interview with a friend of mine, Doug, who wrote this amazing book that I've had the privilege to read a couple of times. And today I'm going to ask him a couple of questions based on my feedback of what I read, some of the questions that I have, and I'm pretty sure it will probably be questions that most people who read this book will probably have similar questions. So I think it will be a useful interview that Doug can share a little bit more about his thoughts and also, give us more insight on his thoughts behind the book. So without further ado, hey, Doug, welcome.
Hi, welcome.
How are you?
Another beautiful day in paradise.
First of all, I want to say thank you for sending me this book. And it was, like I said, it's a work of art. So it wasn't printed. He actually made this himself, the binding and everything. So I feel really privileged to have received this gift. And I had the privilege of reading it a couple of times. The reason I wanted to do this interview with you and ask a couple of questions. I think it will be good for you, for whoever your target audience is, which I don't know who your target audience is. I think it's pretty open. Anybody who's willing to listen to this message. And I like the message, the central message of your book, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is basically Christ's message, which is to love unconditionally, to be a good servant, to be a humble servant, I think is your exact words. And what's the other one? I forgot the third tenet.
Encourage diversity.
Encourage diversity. There you go. So, because this book, I read it from a lens, right? Which we've been talking a couple of weeks already, and we already came to this conclusion that everybody has a lens, like a bias, that we impose into whatever comes our way, like a filter. So, obviously, my point of view was from a mostly standard Christian point of view. I wouldn't even say that I'm a standard Christian point of view. I actually diverge quite a bit from the standard Christianity nowadays. I do believe that the term has lost a lot of its meaning. So, uh, but I do have that kind of that different perspective. So I'm pretty sure that most people who read your book will probably have similar questions. So, the first thing I wanted to point out, and actually something that I enjoyed and I liked, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit further on it, is that you start your first paragraph saying that you're a heretic. And I understood the definition of the word heretic. And under that definition, I would think most of us, well, at least most people who think differently from religion would fit into that category. And I would even go as far as saying that Jesus probably fit into that category. As far as the Jewish religion of his time, he was actually rejected by most of those Pharisees and Sadducees and the people who actually followed the Jewish religion. And they consider him a heretic. So you probably wear that title. And I think that based on your definition, I would probably join you on that one, but I wanted you to kind of elaborate a little bit further what you mean by that, and just let the audience know what you meant by that.
So let's start with heresy in general.
Okay.
Um, it is essentially defined as a belief or an opinion that is contrary to the generally or traditionally accepted religious doctrine. And what that essentially comes down to is somewhere starting as early as maybe the third century. There were some signs of it before, but there were some signs that it took longer than that. But somewhere around the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea,
Right.
where somebody sat down and said, "All right, I want you all to come together and give me one single definition of this religion." Um, and that's the one we're going to manage the organization by. That differs from much of the very early days of Christianity, where diversity was perfectly understandable, not only accepted, but to a certain extent, encouraged. Um, Gnosticism, well, that's not a single theological statement. Gnosticism was actually prevalent in most groups, and it thrived because it was accepted. They didn't have at that point in time this concept of there's one definition, everybody has to ascribe to it, and there's only one way to read and interpret it. I myself go back to those early days where there is not one way of understanding God. And as a result, I'm, shall we say, in violation of the generally or traditionally accepted doctrine that we should all have one understanding and one belief. So, by definition, I'm a heretic.
Right.
I start my book off that way because there's so many overtones to that word. You know, heretic equals bad and horrible. But does it really have to be? And that's sort of that thought process that I wanted people to be open to from the get-go is, do we come in with preconceived notions, and are they actually accurate?
Interesting. Yeah. So I understand. I understand that point of view, and I actually challenge a lot of the. I guess what you would say standard Christianity falls under, which is not. I'm not even sure if that word exists, because there's so many different denominations, so many different ideas of Christianity. The other day we were even talking about that. We just looked at maybe 12 different denominations and how much they diverge in their definition of certain things. Of course, there's like the what they call the essentials of the faith, which most of them fall within that same belief pattern. But
Most.
most, right? Yeah, but but still, yeah, there's definitely a lot of different opinions even within Christianity itself. And especially the last couple of years, I've really started to challenge my own views and think differently since I started studying Hebrew. The Hebrew actually opened up my mind to question a lot of the things that I thought were, you know, you know, were true, or it made me question a lot of things and actually helped me answer a lot of questions that most people don't even go there and don't even try to answer. Um, so as I was reading your book, I have to say that the first part of the book was really challenging for me. That was the part that I had the most trouble with, and I not because I didn't understand what you were trying to say, more because I do treasure the way I do believe that the scriptures is divinely inspired, and the first half of your book you kind of rewrite rewrite the scriptures, or you pick the parts that you believe are congruent with what you believe. So for me it was a little bit of a challenge, I gotta tell you. There
So,
was a
so,
lot.
so let me stop you there for a second.
Sure. Sure.
Um, I'm not necessarily going to say that this is all I believe,
Right.
but the analogy I gave you the other day, which is three blind men trying to describe an elephant.
Right.
And that is, the first one is saying, oh, it's an elephant is this long tubular thing that moves around and is, thick and muscular. And somebody else says, no, 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 it's much shorter and it's swishy because it's more of a tail-like thing. And the third one says, no, it's vast and straight with hair on it like a belly.
Right.
They're all right. But if that's all they see, then that's all they know. And they can easily say to each other, no, you're wrong because it's this other thing. And I'm not trying to give the whole picture because some of those aspects are already well documented. So I just wanted to sort of show that there's other ways of looking at things. So I just handpicked a number of things that helped that show that there are other ways of interpreting items that are years and years old.
Right, right. And I don't have a problem with that. Again, from a reader's point of view, obviously they're not going to have the ability to talk to you while they're reading it. So I wouldn't understand that. I really just saw you taking sections of scripture that fit your view and leaving a lot of them out. And you even some of them even explain why you left them out. Like for example, you excluded all the letters of Paul, some of the things, it made me question a lot of the things. What was the motive behind doing such things? So that's one of the things that I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
Again, not being disrespectful, just trying to understand your frame of mind as you were writing those chapters, those few
Okay.
chapters. So I guess you already answered the question. Um, so I guess my question is: do you believe that Scripture is inspired by the Holy Spirit? Do you believe that there are instructions that were given to mankind through the Spirit? And I know that's a loaded question. That might take a long time to answer,
It,
but
that's a delightfully loaded question. Um, so
so
there's
how
a
would you handpick? I guess I'll give you a follow up question. Maybe that will be easier. How would you handpick? If you don't believe it is inspired at all, I would understand that. But if you believe it is inspired, how did you get to handpick what you think is scripture and what is not? So I guess
so
that's my question. And I don't
let,
mean to put you on the spot. Again,
no, no,
I'm just
no.
trying to understand. And
That's right. As I jokingly said to you before we started, you didn't even give me a chance to see the questions ahead of time.
I apologize. I should have
I'm
sent it to
really,
you.
I'm glad. Don't get me wrong,
Okay.
because that allows us to sort of see things more openly,
Okay.
if you will. Um, there is a book that you can pick up on Amazon called The Invention of the Inspired Text by John C. Poirier, or Poirier, or Poirier. It's a thick, dense book, so I'm not expecting most people to sit and read through it. I mean, it's also $30. Um, but what the guy does is he looks at the word theonespia, which is the word used in, I believe it's Book of Timothy,
Okay.
um, 2 Timothy 3:16, if I remember correctly. And he looks at that word and how that word, which refers to the word inspired, essentially, or just like Abba has, its weirdnesses of meanings and diversity of meanings. This word also has sort of a original meaning and a current meaning. And the way the word was originally used was, sort of a breath of fresh air,
Okay.
as opposed to God put thoughts in their head. Um, Sort of like, you know, if you're if you're struggling with something, and because maybe it's really hot outside, and you're getting overheated and you're sweating, and somebody says, "Come on in, I have a glass of cold water for you to drink." And you walk inside, you drink it, and you're inspired. At least that's the term that they would have used in first century. And the most common use of that word was not a God gave you the words to use, but more of a, you know, God formed Adam out of clay. But it wasn't until he breathed or inspired his life into Adam, this useless chunk of clay, did it come to life.
Right.
That's not quite the same as God took the person's hand and moved it to say the exact words, right?
Right.
And so the use of the word inspired actually started with Origin, hundreds of years after Jesus. And that's when the word got retranslated from this Greek term to the Latin term that said God inspired the writing of. And that mistranslation, if you will, not that it's really any more of a mistranslation than our Father, um, made us lose sight of the original meaning.
I'm all for that. I'm all for that. Like I said, ever since I started studying the Hebrew language, there's a lot of words that I've looked into that even the word church for itself, for instance, right? Like most people think I was having this discussion today on YouTube, responding to comments, and one person kept saying, like, oh, the church was born on Acts 2, and a lot of Christians believe that when the Holy Spirit came down on the day of Pentecost, and I was like, no, because the word church comes from ecclesia in Greek, which comes from hakal in Hebrew, which means assembly of Israelites or assembly of believers. So the church existed way before Acts 2. So,
In theory, it existed in the days of Jesus.
well, in
It was an
theory,
assembly of believers.
right, and that's even before then. That word hakal comes way before then, and even by Jesus's own definition, right? He says, "Where there's two or three gathered in His name, there He is also." So, if you really look at that definition, the church started in the garden, because when Adam and Eve gathered together and God came down and walked with them,
Mhm.
that's the church. So like it's one of the things that I'm writing on my second book that I'm writing right now, looking at these words in Hebrew and trying to like challenge some of these ideas, right? So I completely understand that. Now, where I used to question if the scriptures were inspired by God in the sense of what they believe as in today, right? I don't think that God took the hands of the writers or told them exactly what or how to write, but I do believe in the inspiration by God, where somebody could, write something that is completely being poured into them by the Spirit. And the reason I started believing that is exactly because of the Hebrew, right? Because within the Torah itself, when you look at the Hebrew letters, the original letters, it has hidden codes that even like a supercomputer with artificial intelligence, they couldn't come up with those hidden codes. If it was, I don't think a computer could have done that. So there's a lot of things within the scriptures themselves, and that's how I started really believing that. And that's why I said that the beginning of the book was challenging for me, because that's what made me start believing in the inspiration of the scriptures. So I feel very strongly about taking anything out or adding anything to it, because the scriptures themselves tell you not to do that. So again, I found that challenging. That's what I wanted to kind of pick your brain and see.
I understand. You and I have a difference of opinion on everything pre, let's call it King David
Okay,
ish.
sure.
Um, and I'm okay with that.
Me too.
Remember, encourage diversity. I like the fact that you have yours because at the end of the day, we end up at the same end point. It's like multiple paths up to the top of the mountain. You can take the sunny path and I can take the shadowed path, but we'll end up at the top together.
Okay. So yeah. All right. So I would challenge you to look into this,
Mhm.
the code that I'm talking about. That blew my mind, and it's what convinced me that the scriptures were inspired. It's just impossible. It would be like me getting your book, right? It would be like me getting your book right here, and it only could happen in Hebrew. It wouldn't happen in any other language, right? So it'd be like me getting your book and counting every 50 letters and coming up with an intelligent code within your book. It's literally impossible. And
Are
that
you sure I
happens.
didn't do that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And when you do that with the Hebrew scriptures, you actually find hidden codes within it, and it just blew my mind. And it's not just one or two; it's like all over
Mhm.
the place in the Torah. So, and that's what I mean by I think the Torah, the first five books, were inspired in that sense. I think that
Well,
the prophets, the writings, and even the New Testament were just basically commentary on Torah, and Jesus taught the Torah himself. So I think that that portion of the scriptures were literally. I mean, the Bible says that God dictated it to Moses, right? So so that's what I mean by that, right? And the Ten Commandments, the scripture says that God wrote it with his own finger. So there's certain that's the part that convinced me when I saw the code within the scriptures itself. Like I honestly don't think that even a supercomputer could do that, even with AI that we have today. So all right. So one of the reasons that I spent so much time asking this is because, like I said, once I got past that first section and I had to fight myself through it because I was like, why is it doing this? Why? And it's just the way your mind is, right? Once you get past that. So anybody else who picks up this book, fight through it because the later portions I just thought it was written very beautifully, and the message was exactly like you said. We both got to the top of the mountain. We lined up with the message there because it lines up with Jesus's message. So anybody who reads your book would probably, might have to fight through that section as well and not throw it on the floor and call you a heretic.
I am, okay.
So yeah, I really thought the next sections that you wrote as the epistles of Doug was really so beautifully written. I mean, I felt like I was reading the New Testament, like the style that you wrote it. I mean, I wrote a book myself, and I don't think I could write anything nearly as well written as you did there. So I wanted to say that's something I really enjoyed reading.
Well,
I found it very
the
inspiring.
epistles did start out that way. If you look at the first epistle,
Yeah.
it looks, it feels, it is just so biblical epistle.
Yeah.
Um, in its structure, in its format, in the way it uses words.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. And
Um,
that was gonna be my question, right? Um,
that
they
was
s-
intentional.
yeah, the I think it was up to 13. And I noticed like a pattern as if you were writing to a group of people. And almost the same style of the apostles writing to the churches.
Mhm.
And some of them, it almost was like a follow up of the last topic that you spoke about. So it just made me wonder: is this actually intent? Do you actually have members of the Church of Doug, or it was just were you answering people online or
Um, it was a combination of a couple things.
okay?
One, I fully intended to do it in this order. There's actually, as of the printing I will be doing at the end of this month, there'll be 15 epistles.
Okay.
Um, and I need to get my website up to date because it's really still at the first five. Um, the first five I wrote myself because I wanted to bring up five basic topics.
Right.
And I wanted to do them in a very specific style. And so, yes, the first epistle is extremely familiar to anyone who reads biblical epistles.
Yes.
And if you look at the two, three, four, and five, they are almost as extremely similar, and slowly they migrate to a different feel. But it literally is over five epistles to get you there.
Right.
That's all intentional. Because I had at first a dozen things I wanted to say. And I now have 15 things because I finally got the last two that I wanted to say. But some of those other ones, yes, were in response to people saying, but wait a second, what about?
Right.
Um,
It felt like
and
that. And
and so, yes, I did try to interject them, and anybody who's really cautious and careful might actually figure out which are the three that were not part of the original list, um, because they are ever so slightly different.
yeah.
And that's because they were actually being addressed to a group of people that were very specific, who had a very specific question. Um, the other 12, of which you've got 11 in that book, and there's two more that you haven't seen yet. No, I knew I was going to write them at some point because I knew that that would produce the broader, more whole picture of the message of A, love unconditionally, B, encourage diversity, and three, be a humble servant.
Right. So that's actually kind of my follow-up question. So um
Mhm.
I noticed that then the next section is the saying of Doug, the sayings
Mhm.
of Doug. And I found them all very interesting as well. And that's where you actually kind of solidify these universal concepts, right? Which is these three tenets that you just
Mhm.
mentioned. So just for the audience, without giving too much away, so they could read the book, can you go over these three different tenets that are your basically core tenets of the faith that you just
So,
mentioned?
so the entire sayings of Doug is actually, it comes from the fact that I am well known amongst my friends to use different phrases or sayings to get a point across, and often repeat the exact same thing in different situations to show people that there's some commonality between what you're going through today and what somebody else or what you went through earlier. Um, and it sort of helps you open your eyes to things. Um, I I studied and got very good at things like social engineering and consequently how to persuade people into doing what I want them to do. And there's some actual technique involved in it. And so I wanted to sort of open that up and say to people, look, this is what's going on under the covers. And so, in general, the sayings of Doug are things I typically tell my friends on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Um, and three of those things, which are the what I consider the three tenets of my faith, is love unconditionally. And by unconditionally, I really mean absolutely unconditionally, without judgment, without prejudice, without bias. That doesn't mean love others. That means love. That includes yourself.
Right.
It doesn't mean love just your friends. It means everybody, including that poor person who's lying on the floor without a house. Um, encourage diversity, not just tolerate it, not just accept it, but actually go out and encourage people to think differently and be differently. I tell my daughter all the time that I don't want her to grow up to be a mini me.
Right.
I want her to grow up to be herself. And I have to be careful to not push her into the mold of who I am and how I think. Because I want to make sure that A, she does well in life, but I also want to make sure she does well as herself in life. So accepting diversity is more of a toleration thing. Encouraging it means actually proactively making sure that in the case of my daughter, for example, she actually becomes who she is. And then the last is be a humble servant. Um, I, that was just drilled into me from every single Jesus story I've ever heard all my life. That this is whoever is last will be first. Just all of these things that basically say help others, care for others. Right? I'm not going to say put others first because that's putting a condition, but go out and do that. I wanted to throw the word compassion in, but I couldn't find a way to make it fit and still be short and pithy. Because to me, having compassion for others is a great way to be a humble servant.
Interesting. Yeah, I think maybe the compassion fits, at least in my understanding of the word, fits more into the love unconditionally,
Mm-hmm.
because part of loving unconditionally is being compassionate towards others. Um, the greatest example of being a humble servant that I could think of is Jesus washing the feet of the
Mm-hmm.
disciples. So I mean, what greater example can we have than that? And like you said, like those three things are definitely fit within the message of Jesus. There's no doubt. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
The only one
My
that,
my favorite story
yeah.
is the rich man who says, how can I go to heaven? And Jesus basically says, obey all the laws, but do one extra step. Sell everything you own, give it away.
Yeah. And that's when he walked away sad. Yeah. Like we know that the message of Jesus was very radical. And a lot of the things he said, even the disciples themselves said, those are hard words. Those are hard things to do and to to swallow. Last week we were talking about one of those things, right? Like the forgiveness, which is part of the love unconditionally, I would say. Um, and that's, it's one thing to, it's one thing to forgive, but loving the person who did something wrong against, who wronged you in some way, it's even more difficult. And that would be, I think that will fall under the umbrella of love unconditionally.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a lot about that last week, so let's not, I don't know, rehash it, but it does. The things I enjoy about our conversations is that I'm still thinking about what we talked about last week. And it's one of those things that when you talk, you have these kind of conversations, and you let them sink in. It's something that you need to keep working out your entire life. It's not a one, oh, let's talk about it one time and it's done. No, I think that these things need to be said over and over again. And one of the things I enjoyed too about the book as well is that as I was reading it, I did feel like we were having a conversation. I almost felt like I was talking to Doug through the book. So that comes across very well, because everything you wrote there is, like you said, the sayings of Doug's is literally the sayings of Doug. They're things that you said. We had several conversations in um, different approaches, different subjects, but some of these sayings were consistently there. So yeah, that comes across very well in the book. The next section made me laugh a little bit, only because I know you pretty well, and I kind of know your sarcasm. I know your the way you think. I know the way. So the next section is the one that you talk about yourself as the legend of Doug. The legend of Doug, right? And at first, I was like, he's talking about somebody else. But then, and then I started reading, and I was like, oh, he's talking about his own life story and his dad. And then you talk about that you died, and then you can't. I was like, what? That threw me off a little bit. And then as I kept reading it, then at the end I understood, because at the bottom you said that legends are fanciful stories based on some degree of truth. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? And the reason I'm asking, again, I had is my own bias, right? Is my own lens, right? As I read that, I also thought about, if that was like a you were insinuating something regarding Jesus's own story, because again, that's one of the things that we diverge as well, that we don't think the same way. I believe that Jesus was God incarnate. He's the Messiah. He was the one that God sent to save us. And you don't think that way. So was this section of the book intended to be a little bit, towards that? Because that's the first thing that came to mind. Or,
Nope. So so my first edition of this book did not have the legends of Doug.
I think it's great.
And so I sent it out to a number of my friends to edit, review, and check for spelling and check for everything. And probably my closest friend um, wrote back to me and he said, "Why didn't you write anything about Andrew?" Um, and a little backstory, he and I spent many years at the Renaissance fairs doing various characters. And one of the characters I often portrayed was a cardinal, a Catholic cardinal. Um, and thank you. Right. And at one of the Ren fairs, my character was in a Puritan town, which, if we were to follow the rules of a Puritan town, a Catholic person is to be arrested, and a Catholic person performing any kind of Catholic action would be sentenced to death. And as it would happen, I am in this town trying to stay quiet and hidden because I'm trying to play a Catholic priest in a Puritan town. And I'm walking the streets because my wife said, "Hey, let's go shopping." And I stumble upon some Puritans who are harassing some good Catholic French girls who were trying also to be as non-Catholic as possible while still playing a character who is Catholic.
Right.
And I, of course, let slip a few Catholic thoughts to let the ladies know that they're at peace and God still loves them. And that raised a whole hullabaloo amongst the actors because I should be killed for that. And I looked at it and I agreed with them. And so we quickly changed the skit from me just trying to be quiet to no,
Your execution.
I get called out, handcuffed, dragged before the court, convicted and killed. Right? All in front of the audience, the paying customers. And I basically had to wait a long time for the customers to finally move away because it was a really great skit. When they finally did move away, I was able to move on and go play a different character. Played a monk instead. And so my friend, of course, said, "Well, why don't you describe him? I mean, that's a perfect example of, doing what is right, doing what is proper, even if it costs you your life."
Right.
Which is a very common first and early second century Christian thing to do. And being an avid supporter of early Christian thought and methodologies, I wrote the story. So yes, it is actually an entire story of either myself or my Renaissance fair character sort of merged together.
Interesting. Yes. Yep. Like I said, when you read it, like my first thought, right? We always talk about this a lot too, that you said that whatever your first impression is or whatever your first thing, that's usually your bias. So the first thing that I read, I was like, is he trying to say something here? Like, is there something behind this? Because again, we don't believe the same thing about Jesus. you do believe that he was a man of God, he was a righteous person, and his message was pure. You even mentioned that the message is more important than the messenger. So
Mhm.
you believe that. Well, I believe that the messenger is as important as the message, right? Because if Hitler came with the message of love unconditionally, I wouldn't believe him because of the messenger, right? So
Well, that let's not get into the similarities of Paul then. Um,
right.
but I would argue that if anybody says, "Here's my message, and I'm living my message," so you think I deserve to die because I am violating Jewish laws and I am disturbing the peace, then if this behavior is disturbing the peace, then go ahead and crucify me because that's what you're going to do. I'm not going to fight that because fighting that would be counter to the love unconditionally attitude. So I see Jesus as somebody who, A, really had no control over his life at the end. Um, but at the same time, he chose to control what he could control, which was live the message to the last second. And to say to the person beside him, essentially, you and I will be together moments from now. You will live in paradise. Right? I mean, right to the last second, he is still being the message that he is trying to portray. He never gave up on it, right to the end.
So within that
So,
context, what do you believe in paradise, or do you just think that was something Jesus said?
so go to the end of my book, and you will see that I I claim very emphatically to not know,
Right.
and because in the argument of messenger versus message, some of the other things sort of fall out. If you go with the messenger is most important, is more important than the message,
I didn't say more, but I would say equally.
if you say at some point in time, you're going to have to divide the two, and one of them is going to win out. If the messenger wins out, then things like paradise and such become important because that is what Paul tried to, you know, encourage us to understand. If the message is more important, then how you live your day-to-day life becomes the thing you focus on. And living every single day according to the message is enough of a battle that worrying about the stuff that's beyond is immaterial. Now, having said that, I also buy into the early arguments of a human being is nothing more than an atom, which is a bunch of material physical clay that God breathed an immortal soul into. So if I die, that which is physical is going to die. But how can a physical thing have an impact on an immortal thing? So the soul will live on. Where, how, etc. Not my problem right now. My problem is dealing with the day-to-day living here.
Fair enough. Uh, so this is kind of a follow up question because, and I think you again we talked about this. And you mentioned it last week as well. That you couldn't explain what happened to me, right? The miracle. But I do. I got a sense from your book that you don't believe in miracles or the supernatural, you explain a lot of the things that most people believe to be supernatural. And I give you a
So,
solid
so
example, like the feeding of the 5,000, right? You kind of
let's
explained
let's
it
go through
away.
that one.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let's go through that one because I like that one.
Right.
That one to me is a perfect example of we teach a story and people decide that the miracle is that more bread and more loaves and more baskets magically appear.
Right.
So that at the end of the feeding, not only is everybody fed, but look at all this extra stuff left over. And part of me says the scientist in me says there's a problem with the story if that's the miracle, right? You're breaking people up into groups of 50 and 100, and there's 5,000 people. So that's basically minimally 50 to 100 groups of people. And somebody is grabbing a basket and handing the basket out to the next person. And yet, somewhere, a basket appears out of nowhere and nobody notices it. How did that happen?
A
Right?
basket appears out of nowhere.
Well, yeah, because remember, at the end, there was all these baskets.
12.
Right. Where'd they come from?
They started with 12. What multiplied was not the baskets, was the fish and the bread.
Doesn't matter. I take a fish and I hand it to somebody, right?
No, you take the basket and hand it to somebody.
That has a fish in it.
Right. Yes.
Okay. Basket or fish, it doesn't really matter. All of a sudden,
And that's
another
the
one
miracle, right?
magically appears. See, that to me is not a miracle. That to me is not believable.
Right.
On the
Yeah.
other hand, if you look at my description, which I'll leave to those who want to read the book,
Right. Right. We don't want to give too
it
much away.
perfectly explains it
It does.
how that happened.
But that's the point of a miracle, right? The miracle is supposed to be unexplainable. Like, for example, my healing, which is like something you brought up last
We'll
week.
get to your healing in a second.
Yes.
Right? The miracle isn't the multiplication of baskets and fish and bread. That's not the miracle. The miracle is getting 5,000 people together to essentially potluck share, which is, in my opinion, what more likely happened. But to get them to do that without anybody saying, I'm going to stuff my pockets and walk away, but I'm going to be the same caring, sharing, giving person. And to get 5,000 people to all do that at once, that's not reasonable either. That's a miracle that I can believe happened because
I would
Jesus
disagree with
really,
you on that, but I'll tell you why in a little bit.
Jesus can perform miracles, and that's a good one,
Yes.
right? That is one that I have troubles believing would happen under any circumstance short of miraculous encouragement. So I still see that there's a miracle there. I just don't think it is, I have a basket, it's got a fish in it. When I hand it to you, there's now 2 fish in it, so that you can have some fish and pass it on. Right? That's the piece I don't buy into. In other words, the science in me says, matter is neither created nor destroyed. Right? So if that's true, then how can I justify when I get the basket, it's got 1 fish in it, but when I hand it to you, there's 2 fish in it. Right? Where did the matter come from?
Okay, so that's again, that's where we kind of differ a little bit because the matter came from the same place where creation came from, which is God spoke and it happened, right? So like I said, I believe that Jesus was God incarnate. So he could create matter out of nothing. That's what he did in creation. That's what he did in creation. He created matter out of nothing. You're talking about the limitations that we have in our physical realm. That's why it's called supernatural, right? That you're talking about the natural, and and I'm talking about the supernatural. The supernatural is beyond the natural. It doesn't follow the laws of physics. It doesn't follow the laws of science. That's why it's supernatural. Otherwise, it would be natural. Um,
See,
but
and I'm okay with you buying into that theory,
right, okay,
because that is just as viable as mine.
yeah, and the getting 5,000 people to share resources is not that unusual for the Hebrews, the Israelites, right? They have actually I'm actually studying that this week because it's this week's Torah portion is Leviticus 23, where they have the feasts of God, the feast of Adonai, the feast of God, and some of these feasts, for example, Sukkot, which is the feast of the tabernacles.
Mhm,
Basically, the rich and the poor all go outside the city and they all camp in temporary dwellings, which are the tabernacles. And the rich brings extra resources. They're supposed to bring an offering to God of how much they were blessed that year. So the more you were blessed, the more you have, the more that means you bring a larger portion. And the people
mhm,
who were poor and didn't have anything, they would literally come with nothing, and everybody would share and celebrate together. And it's supposed to be
mhm.
one of the feasts that it's a celebration. It's a celebration for all the blessings you got for the year. So they were actually very accustomed to doing that. So getting 5,000 Israelites or Jewish men or whatever you want to call them together and having them share resources, it's actually something very common for that context. So that would be like something common, not very uh I mean, if you think about if that happened today, I would say it's a miracle. People are selfish today, unfortunately,
I
right? Yeah.
I would argue that they were selfish then too, because
Yeah. I'm
if you have to write a rule, it's probably because somebody broke it.
yeah, sure.
So
People are always gonna
if
be selfish. But
if you have to create a feast of the tabernacle, it's because there's a need for it. And if there's a need for it, it's probably because of a disparity, which obviously there was and there still is. And so disparities cause people who are selfish to
or
act selfishly.
yeah, I completely agree with that. I'm not saying that
So
mankind
to, so to
or
me, it is a miracle.
I'm just saying it's very common for the even today, even like today, like
Mhm,
when they do Shabbat, people that you could be in the you could knock in somebody's house that you don't know during Shabbat and say, hey, do you have an extra seat for me? And they will say, yes, come in. And you don't even have to know them. It's something that they do. It's just the way it is. Like I know people who live in Jerusalem uh, today, and they tell me right that during lunch there they don't close their stores, they don't close their business, they just go to lunch for like 2 hours and come back. And people who are like want to buy stuff, they will go into your store, get whatever they want, to leave the money.
mhm,
So it's a different culture. Is the way they think is very differently, is a different culture. And I would say it is because they feared God. And what I mean by fear is um respected and had a reverence for God. They believe in God, uh, you know, they really do believe in God as if it's real.
mhm,
So they follow these principles because they live what they believe, right? The word faith in Hebrew, which is emunah, it means faith through action, right? You can't have faith without action. That's why there's that verse that says faith without works is dead, right? Because if I say I believe in something, then I live accordingly. And if you don't, then that means you really don't believe it, right? So,
right.
one thing is not lining up with the other. So, going back to that, um, so I guess my question remains, right? Do you believe in miracles in a way that fits within the supernatural, not just the miracles that you can explain and that you mean like because of it's contrary to human nature, and because that happened, that was a miracle, but it was just because people got encouraged to do the right thing. For me, that's
See,
not a miracle.
See, to me, that is such a miracle. Knowing human nature as I have learned over my life, um, that is an immense miracle. That that is that is to me absolutely awe-inspiring. But then again, remember, from my perspective, who somewhat cynical about people and their nature, and knowing what I can and have done in my delinquent past, and having seen other people in their behaviors,
Mhm.
to me, human nature and the way we treat things and such, particularly on the scope of thousands, because also I'm not absolutely certain that he actually had 5,000 people, but he probably had a huge number, and a huge number is still good enough for me to say that's a miracle to get everybody to think and behave in a way that puts others first. Wow.
I'll
I
give you
mean,
that much. I'll give you that
I
much.
I
But
I am
I'm really talking more of the supernatural. Uh,
right. I am blown away by that.
I am
And
blown
that
away
to
by that.
me and that to me is enough of a miracle for me to say Jesus performs miracles,
I would agree
right?
with that. I mean, I think
And
the biggest miracle that we could all experience is what they call being born again, which is literally what you just said, right? So yeah, I would call that a miracle. But I guess the question remains: you still have
I can honestly say I know they exist, right? Because you're not the first person, by the way, who has shown me or testified to me about things,
right?
right? And I've got my own experiences that are not quite so traumatic as yours, but nonetheless equally impressive from my perspective. Um, that tells me that there are things that happen that I cannot explain with science. And I know that they're there. I know they exist. And so, yes, to in that respect, I do believe there is some miracle going on out there. And I really truly believe that while a lot of it is, within the standard deviation curve, so to speak, of what, can be defined as expected, um, not all of it is. And I'm humbled by the fact that, yeah, of the stuff that doesn't fit, we're going to get explanations in the future that do make it fit, but there'll still be stuff that still falls outside that I don't think will ever be described.
That's a good answer. All right, so I think I only have one more question for you, and this
Sure.
is almost like a pun, right? Like a joke. Like since you like puns so much, I actually shared the book. I showed the book, but I didn't say the name of the book. It's called The Church of Doug, right? So, what did you mean by that title? Are you starting a new denomination? Okay, so what's the main purpose and focus of
Yes
your
and
book?
no. Yes and no. Uh, there's the what is it? The Church of the Macaroni. There's the Church of um, there's the Church of Christ, the Church of this, the Church of that, and since what I'm talking about is theological concepts, but they're the ones from my perspective. You could say it's the theological concepts that I espouse to. Um, Now, yes, I do understand where the word church came from, and so I am slightly making a pun with that, um, because At first, it was literally a gathering of one.
Yeah.
um, and and so when I would say that, Jesus, when I pray to God, that makes two of us in the room together. So, ta-da!
That there's your church.
And I know I'm stretching it. And you've got a good question there, because really, if you look at the very end of the book, I do talk about essentially how
Right.
to practice your faith.
Yes.
But I did that not because I'm trying to encourage people who, by the way, there are people now who do go through this stuff and do this stuff. I'm absolutely amazed by them. Um, but they're there to point out again that there's another way of seeing these things. So, for example, the Eucharist is a great example. The Eucharist that you get in most churches today is a transfiguration, or transformation, you know, bread to body, wine to blood.
I think that's
But
mostly in a Catholic denomination.
the Catholics claim that it actually happens.
Right.
The Protestants claim that it's a symbolic transition,
Okay.
and that it's a symbolic representation of the two.
Yes, that's what
But
most of the
most of
Christian
them.
denominations. Yeah.
But if you go back to the earliest known book of Christianity on how to be a Christian, you know, ignoring things like the Gospel of Mark and such, I'm talking about outside the canon for a
Oh,
moment.
sure.
The oldest known book that we actually still have a copy of is called the Didache. And the Didache was essentially a book that was written in pieces at first. And at some point in the early second century, like, 110-ish, somebody actually put all the pieces together into the book form. But prior to that, pieces of it were in different forms prior to it. He was just a consolidator, right? If you look at those early pieces, they date back literally to 10, 20 years after the death of Jesus. So we're literally talking people who not only have an intimate understanding of Jesus, having spent day to day with him for years in many cases, but they knew what his day to day rituals were. And they basically put those down in a book so that non-Christians, because none of them were Christians, but non-followers of the faith
Right.
who wanted to become followers of the faith needed to know what it is they were getting into and how to behave as a Christian, which of course they weren't Christians back then, but how to behave according to this theology or this understanding of theology. And they actually spell out how to do a Eucharist. And the Eucharist in that book is not what they do in most all churches today. It's actually what I wrote. I basically lifted it out of the Didache, right? Cleaned up a little bit because there's some translation issues and such, but essentially that's the message. And that is entirely different, has an entirely different theme on how to celebrate a Eucharist.
Interesting.
But that's what they did then, as opposed to what we do today. So I wanted to throw stuff like that in to let people know it doesn't have to be the way you're currently been brought up and taught. There's actually older methods that looked at life differently than we look at life today. And same thing, I mean, that's why I spent so much time earlier in the Old Testament talking about the Samaritans. because we just think of them as, oh, they're just the most hated person out there.
Right.
But there's actually a history there. And there's a relationship there that actually existed. That if you didn't know that relationship, you wouldn't understand where the animosity came from.
Yep.
So I put that stuff in here not to tell you how to create a new faith, but rather get you starting to think about there might be other versions out there, and to not only accept the fact that there could be differences of opinion, but to actually encourage people to let each of us be different.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I think that kind of covers all my questions. Wanted to give you an opportunity to let people know where they could find you or share anything that you want to share, additional information that you want to share. Maybe are you gonna publish the book and where they could get a copy, or are you making it available on, or are you gonna do one by hand and send out?
Um,
Just, I mean, if you're gonna have like an e-version of it or something
there,
available,
there
if it
actually is an e-version out
there we go.
there,
Okay.
and the most recent version was from yesterday. I've got a couple of typos I want to fix up and such. And so in the next week or two, I'm going to put out a final version of my third edition, whatever. You can find it on the same website that you know about, Van Clark, and that is churchofdoug.org.
Right.
And hopefully in the next week or two, I'll put in the rest of the epistles. I've got a couple more pieces of humor that I want to add in, just because if you don't laugh, you cry.
Yep.
So it's fun to laugh.
Definitely.
And yeah, there's a link on there to scripture which can allow you to download a PDF version of this book.
Very nice.
Um, it's
I'm gonna put all the information on the description of this video when we
sure.
put it online. All right.
Yeah, I welcome anybody. The the first page, once you get past the title, includes a link to my email, so you can anybody who wants my email can get it that way, as opposed to me posting it on the web, so that they can I can start getting spammed. You know,
Where is I don't see
but
it.
yeah,
Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Nice. Okay. Yeah.
right there with the copyright.
Like I
You
said, I
know,
really enjoyed reading the book, and especially the second time around. And then also because I got to know you more between the first and the second read. So I think I understood it more from the perspective of like knowing you. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to ask these tough questions, because people who might pick up the book might not have that understanding or know you like I know you now personally. So they might have a totally different perspective. It's a little bit of a shocker at first, especially when you don't know the author
well,
directly.
I am a heretic.
You did warn us on page one, so yeah. But I did enjoy it, and I also enjoyed this interview. So thank you very much, and we'll talk again next week. We'll find a different topic to talk about, and we'll keep having these conversations that I enjoy.
All right,
Well,
we'll talk next week.
all right. Thank you. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye bye. Shalom.
Shalom.